ready to start. We are going to speak, each of us, for about 15 to 20 minutes, not more than that. And after that, so we should be done, I think, by about 1:40. And then hopefully we can have some questions and comments from the audience. All right, so I think without much further ado, we'll go in alphabetical order. So I invite my colleague, Meghan Jablonski, to start. Go ahead, Meghan.
Okay, thank you so much, Jami. Thank you again for organizing this event today. It's such an honor to be here with everyone and to be with Ann and Parthiban and Jami, and for all of you joining us. Thank you. Thank you for making the time, and thank you for being a part of this effort to gather in community at this time. And I do see, just from the images that I can see in front of me, that we're coming from all different places, some in our homes, some it looks like work, some I can see seem to be working in a medical field right now, and I want to extend my heartfelt thanks and appreciation for everything everyone is doing on the front lines, so to speak, and everything that we're all doing at this time in coming together. One thing that I kept circling back to as I was preparing some thoughts for today is how nothing quite feels like enough, right? Nothing quite feels like the right words or the thing that kind of ties it all together. And for me, I think that really speaks to sort of this process we're in of getting our footing, understanding the current moment, and kind of relying on the tools and perspectives that we have to start to put some of these pieces in place as we take stock and move towards rebuilding. So in my thoughts today, there are a few points that I'd like to share. I'll start off with a little bit more about my work, a little bit of context with the class Virtually Yours, Relating in Reality in the Digital Age, that I've been teaching at Sarah Lawrence College for about the past, I think this is the 4th or 5th year of it, and it's striking how timely the class has felt throughout, but how now suddenly so many of the themes and the things that we've been thinking about in Virtually Yours feel that they're very much part of day-to-day life in a more present way. So I'd like to share a little bit about the context of that class, how it may fit with the current moment, some ways, some considerations and limitations in approaching social connections virtually, and a little bit about how those, where the benefits may be moving forward in the different phases of this process. So acknowledging this is a humble offering, but hoping there may be some power in the places where there's opportunity to connect. So just to start out, a little bit of my background. I am a clinical psychologist. I've been at Sarah Lawrence for about 6 or 7 years now. And before I was teaching, I've worked in a number of inpatient, outpatient, emergency room settings. And one of the first clinical experiences I had was right after college as an undergrad, was working in an inpatient adolescent unit during, right before and after 9/11. And there's so many moments of the current moment, of the current pandemic, that I've called to mind at that time, this sort of process of being in a collective experience, a collective trauma, right? Though some of us are impacted more immediately, and maybe some of us impacted less immediately, there's very much of this sense of being in something together, right? Something is changed in some way for each of us. And there's also this call to continue to do what we do, right? To continue to, you know, for those in caring roles, continuing to do that work, continuing on with the work of teaching and finding a way to have remote learning going on, finding a way to be a student when things can feel, I often think of it, feel like we're moving through Jello, right? Even though we're doing this in this change kind of altered space for now, there still is this effort to move forward. And that is something that's been coming to mind for me as a point of reference for this time. And to think a bit about Virtually Yours, one thing that has struck me about this class is that it had come out of a course I was teaching on attachment and human bonding throughout the lifespan. And over the semesters, more and more students' conference projects were becoming focused on the ways in which we relate to each other, connect with one another online, and connect through virtual spaces, connect with AI, artificial intelligence, and become attached to the devices themselves. It was something that I was thinking about more in my practice as people were finding their way more and more through dating apps, through navigating friendships and social media, and finding ways to help relieve loneliness or to feel a sense of connection. And something in my own life too is technology becoming more, in digital spaces becoming more and more a part of day-to-day life and connecting. So one thing that I was very struck by during the first interview process for that class is how many people came to interviews having had the experience of having some very meaningful or transformative experience that took place through a digital platform, through meeting, maintaining friendships through social media, maintaining long distance relationships, romantic partnerships, or connecting with communities that they otherwise felt isolated from. So these meaningful or transformative experiences that the physical environment, for whatever reason, wasn't providing space for. And that is an element that's been very striking to me in this process, is that suddenly we are all in some way finding ourselves in the position where the physical world is not available to us, or we're not able to use it in the way that we've become accustomed to. And some of the fundamental aspects of connecting, right, of feeling a sense of belonging, of feeling seen, of feeling sharing a good joke, of feeling that things are, of seeing a familiar face, all of those things that help to support our sense of well-being in some shape or another are suddenly unavailable to us. And digital spaces have become common enough part of life that many of us have some experience there, but even those of us who have not suddenly find our, you know, where we are fortunate to have it, right, our opportunities for work taking place online, or our opportunity to, you know, share a movie night with a friend, or celebrate a birthday, or gather in some way, are suddenly moving online. And I've noticed that a lot of the authors that we cover in Virtually Yours, like Sherry Trickle, who wrote Alone Together, excuse me, and others are being present in the conversation in a way that I feel helps us find our way through how we connect when our circumstances are bringing us apart. So I would like to just kind of talk briefly about some of the ways that these social spaces might help to support our efforts to maintain a sense of well-being through this time, particularly related to helping us relieve feelings of depression, the prolonged anxiety and stress that goes along with the uncertainty, to help connect us to a sense of being in something together. So the first way that comes to mind is through digital spaces as opportunities to connect with those that we've been separated from, and to also create senses of community. We've all, I think, just by virtue of being in the space together, we've had some contact through Zoom meetings. There's been a number of, you know, themes emerging in social media with the creation of TikTok content, artistic expression, different platforms to engage in journaling and the act of taking stock of our process and how that relates to others. I've had some virtually yours students contribute some of their thoughts and their experiences over the past few weeks, and things that they've found to enjoy together, like connecting through iMessage games that you can play with a partner. You know, so people are finding new opportunities to connect with one another, to use these spaces in ways that we have discovered and are maybe enhancing in some ways. So it's a way to kind of help lessen that separation. It's also an opportunity to kind of find ways to transcend our four walls, transcend the limitations of physical spaces. One way that we've been thinking about in Virtually Yours classes too is the way communities can carry on, right? Communities that had existed in the physical world or will continue to exist are now available to us through live streaming, say yoga classes, or live streaming church services, and different social groups. I know at Sarah Lawrence, Slack has continued to carry on, which has been a great resource. And there's been a number of new opportunities to share spaces with maybe, you know, friends that were separated by long distances. We can share these new things together. One thing very concretely that I did want to mention here too is the efforts of health and wellness services at Sarah Lawrence College to keep telehealth and teletherapy services available to students throughout this time and throughout the semester. I was in contact with Dina Nunziato, and I'm able to pass on a bit of that information too, that health and wellness services will continue teletherapy, telehealth services for students through the end of the semester. And then they are also available through the mobile support system, where after I finish up, I can put that resource sheet, excuse me, onto the chat. So that's available for any students who are interested. If there are any alumni who would like support in finding an appropriate referral or recommendation for treatment, health and wellness services will also be able to help you navigate, excuse me, finding a referral. Okay, so I wanted to touch on those ways of connecting with community, way of connecting with services that are in the real world. Another way that I think virtual spaces have been serving us in this moment is in the connection to parasocial relationships. So the relationships, not just that we have to real people in the physical world, but the parasocial relationships that we have to either fictional characters or real celebrities or YouTube content creators or even political figures that can be a source of groundedness and centering and connection for us. Right now, there has been a fair amount of research done on the benefits of parasocial relationships or connections to celebrities or characters or YouTube content creators that can help mitigate loneliness, can help us feel connected, and can help us feel more grounded. And I've sort of looped around to loneliness a couple of times. And I think that is one that is quite significant in not just being an unpleasant or unwelcome emotional experience, but loneliness in the UK, for example, has been declared a national health crisis for its impact on both emotional, cognitive, and physical health. So similar to depression, anxiety, chronic stress, loneliness can really impact our overall well-being, including, of course, our immune system, right? So supporting our sense of connectedness, our sense of feeling seen and belonging at this time is an important way of taking care of ourselves, also an important way to fortify our own being, to our whole being. To that end, too, virtual spaces are the third part that I'd like to touch on. Something many of you may have noticed popping up in news feeds, or maybe even different conversations or your own experience, is the increased play of social simulation games right now, like Animal Crossing. If you're not familiar with Nintendo's Animal Crossing, it's this very gentle, animated space where there's not much heavy action that happens. You have these very gentle, pleasing characters that you build, and there's sort of an economy based on trade and things that you collect. And if you know other people who play the game, you can connect with those characters. There's this endearing story in the news this week about someone posting on Twitter that they had turnips for sale in Animal Crossing, and they wanted to purchase turnips, and they put that out into Twitter, and the actor Elijah Wood responded and then visited this person's island through Animal Crossing. So it really became this opportunity for a bit of uplift, and this interaction that the real world likely wouldn't have brought about on its own. So I do want to note, kind of with all of these, just touching briefly on all of these points, that of course there's a benefit to mindful engagement in how we use digital spaces now, as with any time. I read a piece in the Times this weekend by Cheryl Price, who offered what I find to be a really useful analogy of screen time to food groups, as we think about food having different groupings and different nutritional values, and serving us in different ways. Screen time, there can be benefit to thinking of screen time in that way as well. Certainly thinking about what parts feel nutritious, when it feels like we've had our fill, when we may be pulled towards stress scrolling, similar to stress eating in a way. So being mindful of how and when we're reaching for our technology, in terms of what we're hoping for and how it can serve us, and how to maximize those opportunities to maybe find what we need there. In moving forward, I've also been thinking about this moment we're in terms of having, in the process of finding our footing, is sort of having three phases, where over the past few weeks, we're kind of moving through this adjustment of kind of just the shock of how quickly this transition occurred, getting our footing of where it means, taking care of our basic needs, right? Doing our best to secure what we need. And then, moving towards this idea of a transition back into the world, and imagining and even playing around with virtual spaces to, experience what it might be like to go back out there, and even dreaming. I often refer to dreaming as sort of the original virtual reality that's kind of built into us, that when our conscious mind, or even our unconscious minds, become aware that there's a new situation we need to adapt to, often our REM dreams can serve us to maybe create different scenarios of what that might be. But for right now, I kind of think that we're in sort of this doldrum period, this sort of patch of the sea where it feels like the winds have kind of slowed, and we're finding our best path through this uncertainty. And I think this can be a really useful time, that maybe now that maybe some of the novelty of these new ways of connecting might be waning a bit, to really keep in mind reaching out to those we care about, or those we might want to check in on, and thinking about how we can continue this sense of community. So I think that might be just about time. I'm sure there's a ton I missed in there too, and would love to get to any questions towards the end.
So An, I guess you go next. Thank you, Meghan.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Ali. I'm an economics faculty member at Sarah Lawrence College. I joined the college in 2019. My research and teaching focus on political economy, inequality, and environmental justice. And the talk I'm going to give today is who lives on the wrong side of the COVID-19 track in the United States. I'm going to use some data to answer this question. So this research is motivated by a quote, the quote, wrong side of the track. So where does this come from? So in 1929, Thorne Smith, an American supernatural fantasy fiction writer, wrote in his book Stray Lamb that in most commuting towns, there are always two sides of which the railway tracks serve as a line of demarcation. There is the right side and the wrong side. Translated into terms of modern American idealism, this means the rich side and the side that hopes to be rich. So motivated by this, I want to look at who lives on the wrong side of the COVID-19 track. So what does that mean? It means I want to answer this question: is there a geographical association between the infection or infection density of COVID-19 and the social and economic status of local population? Infection means how many people are infected, and infection density means how many people are infected per capita in the in the location. Yeah. So there have been some early evidence showing that there is a racial inequality in the COVID-19 pandemic. In other words, racial and ethnic minority populations are overrepresented in infections and actually also deaths caused by COVID-19. But here I'm presenting some statistics on infections. This is data from the CDC last week, April 20th, 2020. At the national level, among the 195,308 cases, confirmed cases, positive cases, whose race is specified, 33.60% are from Black population. And among the 184,038 cases whose ethnicity is specified, 23% are Hispanic population. Compare that with the racial and ethnic composition of the country. Only 12.67% of US population are Black, and 17.81% are Hispanic. So apparently, the racial and ethnic minority populations are overrepresented in infections. Actually, you can see similar trends in deaths too. So the question, going back to the question, who lives on the wrong side of the COVID-19 track? Apparently, based on the data I have just shown, we need to examine the racial and ethnicity dimension. We're going to look at the percentage of Black population and the percentage of Hispanic population of each local community, and how that correlates with the infection rates in the community. But beyond that, I will also look at poverty, measured by the percentage of population whose income is below one-half the poverty line in 2018. The poverty line in 2018 in the United States is $12,784. So half poverty line will be around $6,000. So a percentage of population whose income is below $6,000. And I also look at household median income and education, the percentage of population below high school education, and unemployment, percentage of labor force who is unemployed, and also health insurance, percentage of population without any health insurance coverage in local communities. I'm going to look at how these dimensions of socioeconomic status correlate with COVID-19 infections. And for COVID-19, I'm going to look at case counts from counties. So all these will be on county level. I'll look at how these socioeconomic status in counties correlate with the or associated with COVID-19 case counts in the counties. And of course, I will control for confounding factors that are beyond the dimensions of socioeconomic status. These factors include population density and total population. So here are the results from the statistical analysis. I want to, here's the table. I want to tell everybody how to interpret the table if you have a difficulty. So on the left are all the variables of socioeconomic status that I'm examining. And the column we need to focus on is the last column. The case counts in county representing the effects in percentage. So what is this? What does this mean? This means as the variables on the left, on the very left in the table, as the variables there increase by 1 unit, by what percentage will the case count in the county change according to the last column? So for example, if you read the table, the first line of the table, this will be if the percentage of Black population increased by 1 percentage point, the case count in the county will increase by 2.85%. This is what this means. And similarly, if the percentage of population below one-half poverty line, that's $6,000, increased by 1 percentage point, then the case counts in the county will increase by 4.77%. And all the other statistics have similar interpretations. I highlighted the statistics that are the data that are statistically significant. So these are the blue ones. So apparently, race, poverty, and household median income below a certain threshold and education will have a positive effects on case counts in the county. I want to highlight one point here, that is household median income. So if you look at these two variables, household median income and the square of household median income, one is positive, the other is negative. So what is actually showing here is we're going to have more cases when income increases. And once the median household income passes $124,000 per household, then we'll have fewer and fewer cases when median household income increases. So it's if you put that in a curve, it'll be like a inverted U-shaped curve. More cases when income increases, but once the income passes a certain threshold, then the cases will decrease. So this is how to interpret the results. So what does this mean for policy? Apparently, the COVID-19 pattern closely mirrors current geographic patterns of social, economic, and environmental injustice. My research and teaching focuses environmental injustice, and I have looked at the results from China, the results from the United States nationally, And this semester, I'm doing a analysis on environmental justice in Westchester with my students in my class. So we do see similar pattern appear, like in Westchester. If you look at where the pollution facilities are and where the minority population, low-income population, and less educated populations are, they are highly correlated. So we do see COVID-19 is mirroring such a pattern. And also, this also means without policies focused on minority, poor, and less educated communities, the pandemic will likely exacerbate inequality. They are the people, or they are the communities who are negatively impacted most by the pandemic. So we need a policy that is not colorblind, not class blind. And more to come, this is a county level analysis. And I'm currently working on data on the zip code level. And the reason why I need to move from county to zip code level analysis is county level is aggregated. It masks sub-county variations. So for example, it assumes the Westchester County as a whole, but clearly there will be variations within Westchester County if you look at Yonkers or certain parts of Yonkers versus other parts of Yonkers. And that pattern, that variation is masked by county level aggregation. So the next step for me will be to look at zip code level analysis. Yeah, so thank you. This is I just want to share with you some results from the current data.
An, can I expand? Are you taking this PowerPoint off?
Yes.
I'm just trying to put this into the big grid. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. My talk is called Beyond Pathogenic Politics. As I was working on this presentation, I was reminded of a relevant essay by the famous British philosopher and essayist Bertrand Russell. And the title of this essay was An Outline of Intellectual Rubbish, in which he argued that all through history, dark tides of obscurantist ideas have sought, sometimes very successfully, to subvert sensible ones. One of the more amusing passages was about Benjamin Franklin's invention of the lightning rod, and here's a direct quote. When Benjamin Franklin invented the lightning rod, the clergy, both in England and America, with the enthusiastic support of George III, condemned it as an impious attempt to defeat the will of God. For as all right-thinking people were aware, lightning is sent by God to punish impiety or some other grave sin. The virtuous are never struck by lightning. Therefore, if God wants to strike anyone, Benjamin Franklin ought not to defeat his design. Indeed, to do so is helping criminals to escape, unquote. I thought to myself that we might have a lot to learn from Russell's essay and the entrenchment of obscurantist ideas among the elites of society who have peddled a certain view of the economy that has plunged us into the current catastrophe in which we find ourselves. It is obscurantism 21st century style that repeatedly throws up the bogeyman of socialism anytime sensible public policies are proposed. And yet it is this stubborn refusal to break out of tunnel vision thought that has created the basis of this crisis, making it so difficult to conceptualize alternative policies or even to understand how we came to the current situation. In fact, seen in retrospect, the current second major crisis of the 21st century appears to eerily parallel the first one at the end of the previous decade. Then as now, the prelude to the crisis was a period of hubris in elite circles whose triumphalism celebrated GDP and stock market growth and falling unemployment rates. Then as now, those same elites, whether in politics, the corporate world, or mass media, were blindsided when the world fell off the proverbial cliff. One may wonder, why did they not see the troubling structural problems brewing under the superficial economic booms in each of the 2 decades of the 21st century? And yet, all the troubling signs were there in both contexts, although they were rendered hidden because of ideological reasons. I'd like to suggest that if we want to stop the recurrence of cataclysmic crises and claw ourselves out of this one, we need to take a longer run view of the causal factors that repeatedly plunge us into such crises, going beyond the conventional preoccupation of boosting stock markets and economic growth. Now, there's a considerable literature on financial market liberalization, which has accelerated the flow of speculative finance since the 1980s, what the great economist John Maynard Keynes called casino capitalism. And a number of authors have related casino capitalism to the subprime crisis of 2007-2008. I will not discuss that issue here. However, I will argue that if casino capitalism has been responsible for creating toxic financial assets, it has had another consequence. To understand this issue, it is worthwhile quoting Dr. Margaret Chan, the Director General of the World Health Organization, who in 2009 said, quote now, "Last year, our imperfect world delivered in short order a fuel crisis, a food crisis, and a financial crisis. It also delivered compelling evidence that the impact of climate change has been seriously underestimated. All of these events have global causes and global consequences with serious implications for health. They are not random events. Instead, they are the result of massive failures in the international systems that govern the way nations and their populations interact. In short, they are the result of bad policies. In far too many cases, economic growth has been pursued with single-minded purpose as the be-all, end-all, cure-all for all. The assumption that market forces could solve most problems has not proved true." Close quote. So the narrow pursuit of growth and quote-unquote free markets has produced climatic disturbances and large-scale deforestation, in particular in the global south, in which countries are under the mandate of free trade agreements to pump out the purported comparative advantage in cash crop exports and raw materials. Casino capitalism has led to what are called land grabs in the global south by domestic and foreign investors for commercial or speculative purposes. The felling of trees and deforestation have also been caused by strip mining and large-scale commercial farming projects, thereby, as one author put it, quote, "helping to create the perfect ecology for breeding newly virulent and pathogenic influenza viruses," close quote, because of closer human contact with wild animals that harbor microbes. And there's a growing body of scientific work that has linked the melting of the polar ice caps to the release of ancient bacteria and viruses buried deep under the ice. In short, the climate crisis, the consequence of relentless growth and privatization programs, has exacerbated the threats from dangerous pathogens. Thus, the appearance of the COVID-19 is not the equivalent of what is called a black swan event, meaning a completely random event. As Sonia Shah reports, there's a long pattern over many decades of the periodic reappearances at random moments of deadly pathogens which have devastating consequences. And as scientists repeatedly warn, worse pandemics are likely to come if we continue on this road of mindless environmental destruction in the name of commerce. In other words, like financial crises, pathogenic crises are known unknowns. That is, they're events that we know will occur again and again, but not when. Casino capitalism has gone hand in hand with decades of right-wing assault against the public health care system in the US, which have left it woefully underfunded and unprepared, while many countries in the global south under International Monetary Fund imposed austerity programs are grossly deficient in delivering high-quality healthcare to their populations. The not-for-profit Trust for America's Health reports that adjusted for inflation, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's budget was cut by 10% over the decade 2010 to 2019. To compound the problem, pharmaceutical corporations like those in other sectors have over the past several decades, since the early 1980s, devoted disproportionate shares of their earnings in stock buybacks relative to research and development expenditures, especially in basic research. Finally, changes in the tax code and other factors have generated massive inequalities, leaving low-income people to be the most vulnerable ones facing this pandemic. In other words, for the pandemic crash of 2020, all the preconditions established over many decades were in place to create the perfect storm, just like those leading up to the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Then as now, blind faith in our current market architecture ruled in elite circles. The problem is that, like the theocrats of old, the high priests of economics and their political mouthpieces in the mass media and political parties continue to elevate quote-unquote market forces to a panopticon-like status, with the prison yard of the market providing little scope for political agency on the part of the population. Anything beyond their rigid dogmatism is treated as witchcraft of the modern era, i.e. socialism, and therefore to be banished politically. This has reached its highest level of absurdity in US elite level political discourse when calls by large segments of the population for universal healthcare in this turbulent period are routinely derided as quote unquote dangerously socialistic. And yet their view of markets and its institutions is utterly at odds with the historical experiences of all capitalist countries, including their switch country, the United States itself. All through the history of the US and other capitalist countries, markets and corporations have been structured, sometimes in very successful ways, to deal with urgent social needs. Consider the much more progressive taxation system that prevailed through the 1970s. Not to mention environmental and consumer rights laws of the 1970s and 1980s, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and so on. All of which constrained and restructured the economy, including corporate behavior, in important ways. As legal historian William Novak shows, extensive social regulations at state and municipal levels date back to the early years of the American Republic. Would we say that the US was a quote-unquote socialist country then? Or consider that German corporations are required to have union representation on corporate boards? Is Mercedes-Benz a socialist company? Right? This is preposterous, but this is the way this thinking goes. The point here is quite simple. A false dichotomy, such as free markets versus big government socialism that is entirely faith-based, has powered economic discourse for decades, creating the basis of the preconditions of the abyss into which we have fallen. Instead, we could have based policy on the evidence-based observations that there are variants of capitalist markets with different political and legal foundations. Those foundations are fundamentally shaped by context and contingency. This is the central point that legal historians of corporations and of the economy more generally have made in a very well-established scholarly literature. The study of business history should be foundational to any good education in economics. You will clearly see the political and legal foundations of the economy, including their wide contextual variations. Okay, leaving aside the diagnostics of the past, what are some ideas going forward? First, given the corrosive feedback relationship between inequality, destitution, ill health, and vulnerability to infection, there is an urgent need to change the tax code to mitigate the highly regressive nature of the current taxation system by bringing it back to its previously more progressive nature, as it was in the 1970s, for example. Second, in the wake of the current public health crisis, state business relations, in particular with regard to the pharmaceutical industry, have to be reconfigured because that industry will play a central role in mass producing a global vaccine that should be accessible to all. For example, share buybacks need to be made illegal as they once were before 1982, so that greater proportions of business retained earnings can be devoted to basic research and development in developing current and future vaccines. Given the massive direct and indirect subsidies that corporations have historically received from the government, pharmaceutical companies should be required to contribute taxes to a government-administered fund, equivalent to the Social Security Trust Fund, that would expand research on pathogens at public agencies like the National Institutes of Health and the CDC. The reconfiguration of state business relations is not a particularly radical proposal. It has always been a central feature of capitalism, as business historians have documented. Given the governance context in which they're embedded, which includes the state-enforced charters, private corporations are quasi-public agencies. Thus, their modus operandi has been restructured many times and continues to be malleable. Third, set up a federal job creation program by training nurses and healthcare workers to man drive-through COVID-19 testing sites all over the country. Use the Defense Production Act, which was set up in 1950, to ramp up production of masks and test kits by private corporations by providing them with working capital. Despite all the opposition to the use of the DPA, the Defense Production Act, for this purpose, it has been used routinely by the Trump administration over the past few years. Deploy major government agencies such as FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers to construct clinics and hospitals. Fourth, ramp up budgets of organizations such as the CDC, NIH, and so on to mass produce a vaccine. Such a vaccine should be dispersed at low cost to everyone. Fifth, and finally, if we are to learn anything from this crisis, it is that universal public health care, both here and abroad, including the global south, should be a human right. It should be complemented by public investments in research on infectious diseases. Such public health priorities should be seen both as a form of social security insurance, right? You get your oil change, your monthly, your periodic oil change in your car so that you don't fall cataclysmically, so that your car does not have some cataclysmic breakdown. That simple common sense presupposes that you have the money to do so, and the same thing goes for the human body. So such public health priorities should be seen both as a form of social security insurance and be the heart of every government's governance framework. Instead, we have been presented with a terrible choice: either not be able to pay one's bills because of unemployment or risk getting sick, and hence all these cries about opening up the economy. This is a horrific choice when there are perfectly sensible alternatives available. But this requires a serious re-examination of the way we think of fundamental economic institutions such as corporations and markets, so as to break free from the tyranny of false dichotomies such as free markets versus big government socialism. Conventional economic thinking is deeply problematic, but it has enormous cultural power. Many people have pointed out the need to emphasize scientific knowledge that is evidence-based to combat the rising tide of obscurantism that denies climatic catastrophes and all their consequences. I would argue that the same evidence-based understanding of the economy, for example, looking at economic history or business history, should be central to combat the obscurantism that has clouded thinking on economic issues for many decades. As the coronavirus demonstrates all too tragically, we must strengthen, not subvert, our society's ability to create socioeconomic and legal arrangements to deal with such threats. This requires a serious re-examination of central concepts in economics and in our understanding of politics and history. And so I'll just say that we have a lot to learn from old Ben Franklin and his experience with his lightning rod. And I'll end there. Thank you. I think Parthiban goes next.
Yes, thank you, Jami. Thank you all, and Meghan as well for sharing, and Jami for putting this together in such short notice, such a short time period. It's really nice to see so many people being able to attend. I'm Parthiban Gandhi. I'm a faculty in sociology. As Jami mentioned earlier on, I'm also the faculty director for the Consortium on Forced Migration, Displacement, and Education. I teach classes on transnational migration as well as forced migration. Currently, I'm teaching a seminar called The Lexicon of Migration with a group of students at Sarah Lawrence. I also lead a short-term summer study abroad program focused on displacement in Malaysia. And I take students from 4 different campuses, Vassar, Bart, Bennington, and Sarah Lawrence College, to to go to Malaysia and learn how to do ethnographic fieldwork, particularly with displaced communities over there. So before I kind of go into my what I wanted to share regarding the impacts of the pandemic, especially on displaced communities, I wanted to kind of send a bit of a thank you and an acknowledgement for the students who have been working on collecting resources and reports and information, particularly during this time, about some of these communities who are largely being left behind and left out of things like receiving treatment, receiving resources, particularly those who are in a lot of these camps, right? These camps and informal settlements around the world, who are severely restricted currently. And I'll share a little bit of some of these cases during this talk. I also, the students that I mentioned include students from Sarah Lawrence as well as the other consortium schools who have been pooling together these resources for sharing with the wider consortium community across the 4 campuses. I also wanted to acknowledge that we have students, including at Sarah Lawrence, who continue to work as part of internships and holding positions with different organizations in New York, as well as across the country, where they have tried to work with a lot of undocumented communities, providing legal resources, legal help, and things like that. So even during this time, it's been great to know that there's this deep engagement from students, college students, particularly concerned with refugees and migrant communities. For my part, I wanted to share a little bit of my reflections on how COVID-19 and COVID-19 related policies have been impacting some of the most vulnerable and marginalized displaced communities around the world. The adoption and enforcement of social distancing, lockdowns, economic shutdowns disproportionately impact highly precarious and marginalized groups, including refugees and undocumented migrants. One significant challenge we're faced with today, as more than half the human population is now under lockdown, is that it's incredibly difficult to know how the most vulnerable are being affected by the outbreak, as well as the social restrictions that are actually being placed upon them. Take, for example, India's nationwide lockdown has left more than 800 million people severely at risk. 2/3 of the population there live in poverty. Many rely upon informal street economies to survive. So without enough reporting and the capacity to move to these communities, it's going to be really difficult to understand and know the effects and consequences fully. We learn from UNN, for example, in the US, the official that there's an unequal, a stark unequal burden of the virus being borne by the marginalized in the United States. We also have to take into account that those disproportionate numbers are also being borne by the Native and Indigenous communities here in the United States. So there are a number of key challenges coming up in relation to the pandemic that directly impact displaced communities. I'd like to highlight a few of these in a very broad sense, and then turn our attention to the special case of the Rohingya refugees in Southeast Asia, who are a violently persecuted community that has been facing the prospect of genocide for more than a decade now. The 3 main issues that I wanted to highlight are the challenges of being under lockdown for displaced communities, the impact of humanitarian work, the impacts on humanitarian work related to displaced communities, also the issue of labor and exploitation in light of the pandemic, where this notion of essential work is being unfairly forced upon the most marginalized. I'd then like to share some of the examples and the cases coming out of the Rohingya refugee communities in Southeast Asia, which is the context where I do a lot of my research and ethnographic fieldwork in. Let's start with the various social distancing and lockdown policies that are in place, which have some very obviously difficult implications for refugee communities, especially those who are forced to live in camps and formal settlements. For many refugees, these policies are a bit of a cruel joke where many of them live in highly overcrowded spaces. They have to share rooms, share water sources. They are not able to take the recommended steps of regular hand washing and cleaning, right? In order to compensate, we have these disturbing examples from countries like Singapore, Iraq, Malaysia, and India, where authorities have taken the steps of spraying, these camps and these settlements with disinfectants, sometimes directly on people themselves. We have a infrastructural issue as well. If you take the example of camps in Greece, like the Lesbos camp, which is built for 3,000 people, but currently hosts close to 20,000 refugees without any sanitation. In Bangladesh and camps of Cox's Bazar and Kutupalong, you have the temporary home to more than 1 million Rohingya refugees. Any outbreak in these camps and settlements could be a disaster for these communities, and many will likely lose whatever general goodwill they may have received from the host societies. Instead, migrants and refugees could become seen as biological threats that need to be contained, to be kept out. And this, of course, extends to the working class poor, such as those tasked with continuing to perform essential services, food, agriculture, delivery, waste management, the invisible scaffolding of our modern society, right? We're likely to see the emergence of these new forms of biological racism and xenophobia framed by the language of carriers and contaminants directed at the most marginalized. Secondly, these restricted movement policies enforced in various host countries has severely curtailed aid and humanitarian organizations' capacities to provide critical help. UN agencies in most countries have had to shift to essential programming only. Local NGOs have invariably been affected by shortage of funds, new restrictions on movement. All this make the work of providing assistance even harder during this period of tremendous need. As the competition for health resources and supplies grows globally, you think about the US demand of foreign-made test kits, masks, ventilators, etc. The likelihood of displaced communities getting left behind seems inevitable. This is hitting refugees particularly hard, and I'll explain this a little bit in relation to the Rohingya. The third major challenge has to do with what we refer to as essential labor, right, and services. In many countries, a lot of that labor is performed by an invisible labor force. It's made up of migrants. It's made up of both documented and undocumented migrants, including refugees, asylum seekers. A lot of this work includes care labor, care work, food service, farm workers, waste pickers, informal day laborers. They all fall within this particular category. And not to mention the thousands of displaced and trafficked people who are largely uncounted in the shadow sectors, including sex work and sweatshops. It's important to note that refugees and other poor migrant communities around the world are not often easily separated. These are largely formal categories that often blur into one another in real life. One country's refugees, another's illegal immigrant. Prejudice and bigotry follow very closely behind, especially along the lines of religious and ethno-racial hatred. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Rohingya community in particular. The Rohingya are they're a very diverse, very heterogeneous community of Muslim minorities from the Rakhine region of Myanmar. For over 3 decades, they've been facing intense persecution by the Burmese state. In the past 6 years, in particular, the persecution has been ramped up thanks to concerted efforts by the military regime and hate-filled propaganda by the Buddhist fundamentalists who are seeking to exclude and eradicate the so-called illegal foreigners, which is the way they tend to portray the Rohingya. This has led to bombings and burnings of Rohingya villages, and the displacement to more than 1.2 million people from the region. Close to 1 million, I think close to 950,000 Rohingya live in the camps of Bangladesh, right, in the bordering country, in camps such as Kutupalong, which is now infamous for being the world's largest refugee camp. Hundreds of thousands have fled to countries such as Malaysia and Thailand, mostly by sea. These countries do not officially recognize the Rohingya as refugees. Malaysia in particular has continuously treated them as illegal immigrants. Currently, there is a major crisis emerging in relation to several boats that are stranded out at sea, carrying hundreds of Rohingya refugees. These boats have been turned away by the governments of Thailand and Malaysia, and currently they're trying to find harbor in Bangladesh, where they're also likely to be refused. Reports are emerging of people dying out at sea, with bodies being dropped overboard or left on uninhabited islands. For countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and Bangladesh, this pandemic has become a powerfully convenient excuse to close their borders to refugees, who are being framed not just as potentially illegal immigrants or terrorists representing a threat to the economic and social well-being of the country, but now they are also being presented as biological threats, right? By being so-called pathogen carriers, by being dirty and unsanitary. Already, upon discovering first cases of COVID-19 close to these refugee camps, the Bangladeshi government ordered a lockdown of the camps there, essentially shutting off access to critical supplies and resources for already desperate refugees. People in the camps are forced to live, 10 to 15 people in shared households, often sharing latrines, sharing water sources with even larger groups. There are limited access to medical supplies, and treatments tend to come from groups such as Doctors Without Borders, very limited to begin with. So any outbreak of the virus will likely be uncontrollable in these camps. In Malaysia, authorities have been enforcing a movement control order that has severely restricted people's mobility, including migrants and refugees. Some of the largest communities of Rohingya outside of Bangladesh and Burma are in Malaysia, and they live in informal settlements. These communities, they are an essential part of the food service and agricultural sectors. They work in some of the largest wet markets in the country as manual laborers. With these new restrictions in place, these refugees continue to work at these markets to ensure food supply for the city, for regular people. But they're also cut off from many of the resources and aid that they used to receive from local NGOs and groups. This is coupled with a recent rise in xenophobic campaigns by local groups trying to get rid of the Rohingya. And this has started seeping into the highest offices of the state. On top of problems channeling aid such as food and medicine to the refugee communities, local groups are currently facing death threats and harassments from locals and authorities for trying to provide for these communities. This is a trend that is unfortunately repeating itself across different countries, especially where the Rohingya are currently. It's exposing their particularly vulnerable position as a stateless population that is largely ignored by the international community. If the threat of genocide wasn't fully realized before, the spate of pandemic-related policies has very much made this an immediate possibility. So that's something I wanted to share. Quickly, I just again wanted to repeat my thanks to all the students throughout the consortium corpus, including Sarah Lawrence and beyond, who have been working to compile as much information, as much resources as possible. As part of the consortium, one of our key objectives and goals is to bridge and try and connect liberal arts education to communities who are displaced, right? To figure out, ways in which we can build networks and opportunities and resources for different displaced communities around the world. Currently, during this period, as we're dealing with this crisis, that these efforts have become even more urgent. Right at the moment where it's become harder for us to figure out ways to provide these resources. So, but I have to say that it makes me feel quite optimistic and hopeful seeing all the efforts that students in particular have been putting in during this time. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the end of the official presentation, but we've reserved time for Q&A for comments, and not sure how to do that with if multiple people have questions, but maybe if you can raise your hand, and then some of my colleagues in the panel can also help me out here in terms of pinpointing who went first. Then I can see Kim has a hand up. Go ahead, Kim.
I had a question for An. One of the things that I've been looking at lately is the racial and gender distribution of the so-called essential workers, particularly the frontline medical workers. And we talk about healthcare workers as if it's a ubiquitous group, but it's actually not. It's very racially and gender segregated, with the white men very much at the top being in supervisory positions, and the ones at the bottom who have direct patient contact being much more women of color. And if you look at the infection rates and death rates among healthcare workers, they are very racially and gender distributed. So I'm wondering how much, and that's just one example, I'm wondering how much of the racial ethnic distribution of infection is partly about the racial ethnic distribution of jobs, and who's doing what jobs where they're more at risk. I don't mean that's the only thing going on, but I think labor is one aspect of the racial ethnic distribution of infection. Just from my very informal investigations, I have not done any analyses yet, any statistical analysis. So if you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. This is a great question. I've tried to include the racial, gender, or socioeconomic composition of the healthcare or essential workers in the analysis, but unfortunately, the data set I'm using, which is the American Community Survey data, does not provide such detail. They only have data on gender composition of the essential workers, but even that data is very highly aggregated. Yeah, it's not as detailed as we can use them.
You might want to look at the nurses' unions. They have some very interesting data on the racial and gender distribution of healthcare workers. National Nurses United, SEIU, both have good data that might be helpful on that to break it down in a little more detail.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All these presentations were wonderful, by the way. I really appreciated them.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Rifki, go ahead.
A macro. I'm on mute. Can't hear me?
Yes.
Can you start again? Because we missed your early comment.
First of all, thank you for a very, very robust understanding of this macro system breakdown in economics, and it kind of shifts the paradigm a bit in the way we look up to government, and now getting into the insides of it and breaking it down in terms, again, of inequality and access to care and the like. The article that you shared with us is something that I would very much appreciate having. Is there a way that I could have access to that article? Or perhaps maybe the author and the name, and then I could access it?
Which article are you talking about?
The one that you read in full about the economy, starting with Ben Franklin.
Yeah, it's a condensation of another published article, which I'll be happy to. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all speakers. It was a very wonderful, enlightening understanding of a very shared, uncertain transition here and political, standpoint and all. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions, comments? I think I had a comment, and I think it comes off of what Rifki just said over here, which is, and I think I was just thinking about this, Parthiban, in regards to your thing, which is that where I think I maybe doubt a little bit not doubt, but this is a kind of a self-critique of what I just said, right? Which is that I ended my talk by talking about what should be done, right? And which is fine, and that's fine. But I think that one has to take into account that you could have a state which is incompetent, which is corrupt, and which targets people, right? So, and I think that kind of ties in with Parthiban, your talk, in the sense that you have the racial targeting of people. So in that sense, if that state is so utterly morally bankrupt, and the state managers and the president and the heads of state are so utterly bankrupt morally, then I don't think there's anything can be done. Just a comment.
Yeah, Jeremy, I think, and this is something that's sadly becoming really, really clear now, at least in these days. And I think it's this coming together of the fact that these states are also the ones who are hosting the largest numbers of these stateless communities. So it's really terrifying to see that kind of sort of moral bankruptcy at the highest level, that sort of xenophobic prejudice, coupled to like going hand in hand with in these places where there's the biggest need, right? So and that sort of like hopelessness and sort of like inability to see anything good coming is something that I've noticed with a lot of like the aid organization, aid workers in Thailand and Malaysia in particular.
Sarah has a question.
Hello. First of all, again, thank you so much for doing this. I think it's incredible that our school and you guys offer things like this, and it's another reason to appreciate where we are, even while distanced. And I guess my question is, especially this year, I've been focusing a lot with Shanaz and different professors on like the importance of critical thinking and the Sarah Lawrence education and how we can see the world and how that's a step towards taking action, and that things aren't immediately taking action. But I don't know what the next step is. Like, I feel like we're entering a period that in certain ways could be a great opportunity to make change happen, a great time for transformative potential and restructuring. But I'm not sure. I know that's a very broad question, but how do you do anything in this time? Like, even if you're paying attention closely and trying to read between the lines of the sensationalist media stories, and if you have any advice.
I feel like one thing that I've been really concerned with, and that's what I emphasize in my talk, is tunnel vision thinking. And and I think that one field, and I don't want to push my own discipline over here and Ann's and Kim's, but this is the discipline that kind of plays a non-trivial role in organizing social life, right? And the way the discipline is taught and learned is really, I think, a major problem. And so the fact that one would need to actually engage economics with politics and history. I mean, I for example, feel that you cannot really learn economics unless you know history. You just cannot, right? And so that would again tie in with realizing that interdisciplinarity is just not, it's not just an intellectual luxury, it's actually an intellectual necessity if you really want to get at understanding these big questions, or these actually deep questions. I don't know if my panelists, co-panelists have anything to add to that. No? Okay. Other questions or comments? We are here. Meghan, you had a question or comment.
Or I did, just to jump on the last question too, with this idea of the path forward. I was slow to get to my mute button, I'm sorry. I do, as in hearing all of you speak, I also, my mind also went to this idea of action and kind of, grappling with this sense of being sort of stuck and things being uncertain, and what might action look like in this moment where we are essentially putting one foot in front of the other and rebuilding that sense of new normal, or rebuilding a space closer to what we're accustomed to. I do find myself wondering, what can action look like in the restraints of our current time? It might not look like it had looked or what it will look in the future, but what are the ways in which we can connect with groups, say virtually, or to organize our time within our communities. And I would be curious on your thoughts, given all of your work, about where those places might be, or if there's work that might come to mind.
Is that, Meghan, is that a question for Parthiban especially?
I think so, yes. Maybe Parthiban, maybe, yes, all of the panel, but certainly, yes, Parthiban's work is very much on the ground. I'm wondering, I guess, how can we help?
Sorry, Meghan, I kind of
Very open-ended question.
sorry, Meghan, your feed was cutting out on my end.
Am I breaking up?
Yeah.
Am I breaking up? Okay, I'm sorry. And my question is sort of how can we help? How can we contribute at the times that we feel maybe disconnected with, the usual spaces?
So at least for one of the things that I notice has become really important right now is to basically to provide as direct aid as possible, because particularly now in this current moment we have so many of these communities who are stranded and trapped. I think a lot of organizations are seeking help simply in terms of like providing food, providing supplies, and things like that. In Bangladesh and in Malaysia in particular, there's an urgent need, particularly now because it's Ramadan, it's the fasting month. So a lot of these issues have become, a lot of these needs have become even more essential. Just being able to even give to charity or donate, like so people can send food to these communities. So it's this kind of like a pretty simple, very direct forms of help that these communities need right now. And this is not even going to the point where we need to start, or we have to get back to advocating for better recognition for all of these communities in the country. At least with the Rohingya refugees, it's just these countries that are hosting a lot of the Rohingya populations. It's pushing them to grant some sort of temporary residency, right? The same way that Portugal has now granted residency to anyone who's migrated to the country. So that is another need right now in order to try and deal with the problem of xenophobia that they're facing.
Okay, so there are questions from Taylor McHugh, and then I know Charles, and then Eric Harden and Mary. So maybe we can, I think Taylor's had their hand up for a while. So go ahead, please. Taylor McHugh.
Okay.
You need to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is relatively simple. All of y'all are right, and everything you're saying is true. But we have a train wreck happening in slow motion. But I don't know how we're actually going to stop the train wreck. And everybody knows it's a train wreck. But, like, what are we actually going to do? Because the truth doesn't matter right now. So how do we get the truth to matter?
Yeah, that's a simple question, but really hard to answer. Well, you're right. It is a train wreck, and I mean, I think part of my question to, I think earlier on, my comment about Rifki and Parthiban was about corrupt, dysfunctional governments, and was actually in response I was thinking exactly of that, and I don't know the answer to that question. What does one do? Maybe anybody else have some?
Well, I just want to say, because if we're just waiting, it's not going to do anything. Voting isn't going to be a solution right now. So what happens? That's all I have to say.
Kim has, did you want to respond to Taylor? Because there are three other
Yeah,
people.
I'll just be real quick about this. voting is not a solution, but there are degrees of hell. And I think that we need to be aware that the difference between, I'm sorry, I'm going to put my opinions in here, between a very suboptimal neoliberal type Democrat versus a nationalist, blatantly racist president we have right now, the differences in terms of policy may be fairly significant, partly for the US population, but also for people like those who are stuck in cages on our borders right now. And no, it's not what we would like it to be by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it makes a big difference, especially for the most vulnerable people. And we shouldn't underestimate that. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny step towards where we would like to be. And no, I'm not a big Biden person by any stretch of the imagination, but the difference between having someone in charge of a task force who actually knows science versus somebody who used to breed dogs, who is who we currently are going to have in charge of the pandemic task force, it makes a difference. It makes a difference. And pulling out of the WHO or not pulling out of the WHO, these things have real consequences. So no, I don't think voting is the answer, but it's a very small thing people can do. And then I think you have to find an organization that shares your values and your goals. And there are many such organizations that existed before the pandemic and that still exist that you can work with. Community-based organizations and NGOs or national organizations or unions or women's, or I mean, there's a lot of different organizations you can work with that can make little steps. That's what we can do, is do what we can do. And I think we all need to do that. But okay, I'll quit giving my political.
I think Carl Barenboim had a question for a while. Carl? No? Okay. Eric Harden, and then Mary Dillard, and then Mohammed Kamara. That's somebody. Oh,
Hi. Hi, how are you? So I have a few comments. I know that we're all thinking about long-term, what we can do once this is all resolved and we go back to a sense of normalcy. I'm on the front lines of this as right now, been for the last few weeks. And actually, normally my role is in cancer research, but I've been redeployed at work to facilitate building COVID infrastructure. And there's just being on these front lines have allowed me to see the importance of just some small things that we can do in the meantime. Right now, the triage of knowledge, fact-based knowledge, scientific knowledge would be the most helpful. We're seeing a lot of patients coming in with a lot of misconceptions. There's just so much out there right now. And because the data is always still accruing, the scientific data is accruing, and it's really hard to figure out what to listen to, what not to listen to. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and that would probably be the first step. Additionally, what I would help promote right now is that I'm currently at Columbia University Medical Center, and we currently have clinical trials open, and I believe next week is the first week of clinical trials week, or I can't remember, it's the week after. We have clinical trials present right now, and what we really could use help with is promoting these trials. We have no standard of care right now for these patients. We have no other ways of alleviating their symptoms. We're learning more things every day. We're repurposing drugs right now, but we have things open to them. I'm fortunate right now when working on a trial where for cancer patients specifically, because most cancer patients are excluded from the COVID trials because of their cancer diagnosis. And there are other biorepositories open for the public as well. And the more that we can accrue to these, and the more that people promote these and know that these are a resource for the public to get involved, the more we'll have solutions, and the more that we can end this a little bit sooner than later as well. It's great that we're talking about long-term, but right now we need something more immediate, because I mean, our hospitals are getting better. We're seeing lower admissions. Our emergency room has gone back to almost normal, but we still have a lot of patients inpatient right now, and we're all working tirelessly around the clock. And there's a way that I think the health advocacy program and community can support us in the field, and that is right now, like, look at the clinical trials page on governmenttrials.org. Look at the ones sponsored by underdeserved sites such as Columbia, which is a minority and underdeserved site. Because we're looking to try and include marginalized communities and these in order to have better representation of them, so that we don't have disproportional just from Caucasian and white representation.
Okay, so we have, I think we have Mary Dillard. You had a question.
I'm sorry, could I jump in just for a second? I'm sorry. I want to thank Eric, and I wonder if he could, would it be okay for him to put those links on the chat?
Yeah, of course.
Share on our chat here.
Of course, I will include those. It's just essentially important right now. We have some great things. We're looking at blocking protein buildup in the lungs that promote to reduce inflammatory responses. We have biorepositories as well, and we're getting more and more each day as well. And it would be great if we could promote these, because this is how we're gonna finally have something other than just trying to make things up and give things palliatively.
Thank you.
Okay, Mary?
Yes, my question was about a question of trust. So I think that people who are in some of the most vulnerable and marginalized categories are very aware of the extent to which they are marginalized. It's part of the reason, for example, for some of the health inequities that we see in the African American communities, for example, or in First Nations, Native American communities. So Jami, you in particular talked about, I think, policy-related solutions, and I'm wondering from all of you, you know, how you get people to actually believe the suggestions that are being made in relation to getting support for their health when they are marginalized, or in the case for Parthiban, for example, someone who is in a refugee camp is really treated so badly from the host society in many cases. And so how it seems to me that trust is sort of this intangible thing that makes a difference in not just people's behavior, but in terms of policy. I don't know if that question was clear, but you all can do with it what you will. I mean, my biggest fear, I'll say, of having taught classes about epidemics and pandemics in Africa is that if there's a second wave, people will not take their loved ones to healthcare providers because of not being able to bury their dead in the previous, the fact that caring for a dying relative is very important culturally in so many places. And the idea that you would have to be away from that person and not know the whereabouts of that person is something that I think after we see what different states do, people are not, there's going to be even further mistrust of different governments.
I think Mohammed Kamara actually has had his hand up for quite a while. And then Jean goes next, if I'm not mistaken, or Sarah. And then Mohammed, Sarah, and then Jean.
Hello, everyone. It's good to see some old faces. I guess my question is in the line of the previous question, but more specific in the US. I think, and your data was very interesting. During my last semester, I did some work on the criminal justice system, and like the data resemble the kind of people that are imprisoned and vis-a-vis the majority, right? So my question is that, you know, that as Jami mentioned, right, we're gonna have things as globalization increases, so we're gonna have more diseases like this frequently. But I feel like the result is gonna be the same moving forward if we don't, well, I guess it's not really a question, but more of like the institutional inequities that exist in our country are also showing through people that have been affected. Can we really be hopeful in the future, knowing that if we don't really fix those inequalities, that these things will continue? That's it.
Okay, so let's take a couple of different questions then. Unless Anne, you want to respond to Mohammed?
I want to respond to Mohammed and also echo Kim, and I think Taylor's question actually. There are two favorite quotes in economics. My two favorite quotes in economics. One is every economic problem is a solved or unsolved political problem. So to make healthcare changes to make economic changes, we need to take political actions. So I want to emphasize voting is important, and hopefully, and I think by observing the news these days, the discussions over COVID-19 like on the media or on other social media or on like Reddit or other platforms have been changing people's thinking about the priority of economy versus health or versus economy versus other public interests. So hopefully in this political cycle, we can see more changes. And another, another thing is not actually a quote, it is actually a phenomenon. So there is economic research or also sociology research called bowling alone. So what that research is showing is more and more people are bowling in bowling alleys, but actually higher and higher percentage of the bowlers are alone. So they're not bowling together, they're bowling like individuals. And similarly, many of these community organizations we are seeing today, of course, if you see the membership of community organizations, they are going up. And more people are participating in organizations. But more and more organizations are becoming fee-paying organizations. So basically you pay a fee and you get some newsletters, but there are actually no community organizing at all. So, we need to change that too, to get the political actions we want.
Okay. All right. Sarah, I think, and then Jean.
I think, and if I read in the chat correctly, I think my question is similar to Jean's, but just curious about that action question still and what we can do, but moving in the direction of looking at the different charities and community organizations that are out there. Like, I know some websites like GuideStar and Charity Navigator and stuff like that help you see where the funds for different nonprofits and stuff like that are going, but I don't know how reliable that data is like right now, or like how updated it is in terms of picking which charity you want to dedicate your time or money to, or like effort to. And I'm not sure how to pick like smaller scale or global scale, like what would make more of an impact, or can we not really evaluate? We just got to make the call from what feels right. Like, I guess those are my questions.
Parthiban, you wanted to respond to a few of these points.
Yeah, thanks for these great questions. And I was kind of like trying to think through Mary's question a little bit about trust, and then I realized that going to Jean's question and what you just asked Sarah, at least in relation to organizations and who do we find our information from, right? And how do we kind of make a decision on where to divert our attention, our resources, and whatever capacity we have to help, right? One of the strange but expected outcomes of what's happening right now is that you have all these larger organizations. Take for example the UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees, whose work has sort of shifted to become this sort of a platform for networking for a lot of local and smaller organizations, because they have to. That sort of interreliance has become much more important than ever before, because local organizations, like especially with the refugees, the Rohingya refugees, they're essential. They're the ones who do the bulk of the work of providing resources. The other group is of course Doctors Without Borders, who are absolutely critical right now. To kind of like one of the things that the UNHCR has been putting a lot of effort in is to try to highlight the work being done by the smaller local organizations, including when it comes to, say, the Rohingya refugees, a lot of religious organizations like local madrasas, local mosques, and so on, whose own work, whose own kind of capacity has been restricted too because of the lockdowns and policies. But they are also they also are the ones who offer sometimes the only spaces and the only resources available to these communities. So a lot of the work being done by these larger global transnational organizations has been to kind of highlight, okay, these are the people who are doing a lot of the work, so are kind of on the ground. They're the ones who have the most direct access. So I think, in a way, maybe we don't need to think so much of the sort of local versus global divide right now, at least when it comes to these organizations, because we can start to see how their become increasingly reliant on one another to do that work, which is, in a way, that's kind of how it should be in the first place. It's sad that it took a situation like this to raise that, to kind of make that possible. But so I would suggest, going through these bigger organizations, if you have a country or a community that you're specifically looking at, and then see what kind of connections they have on the ground. MSF, Doctors Without Borders in particular, are very good at this. They're kind of very, very attentive to different NGOs and different local organizations who are working on the ground. Kind of going back to Mary's question about trust, and it just kind of made me think about some of the work being done by these religious communities, particularly with refugees, who they don't just offer resources and help in kind of what we are used to thinking about, but also in terms of providing the kind of space and support, particularly for these communities who rely on things other than, say, scientific and medical knowledge for their daily lives, right? In things like dealing with death and mourning and losing family members, right? So I think that this issue of trust and also distrust, right? Like, who do you seek, who do you choose to believe, or who do you feel is actually looking out for you rather than looking out for something else, right? Whether that something else could even be like, oh, we care more about the population, so you are sort of seen as marginal, you're not as important, right? So why should that person be, or that community be seeking out your help, right, and your support? We'd rather go to the priest or the mosque or the religious organization that at least is saying that they care more about us, right? So I think that question you're asking, Mary, is absolutely critical, and I don't think we fully understand it. I don't think we are paying enough attention to how important these other groups are in kind of providing that support.
I wanted to make a point about trust here, because I think it's a kind of a really important point, but I wanted to sort of say that there's also kind of a pathological aspect to trust, which is that we have in a number of countries, and I don't think we need to point too far. We have white nationalists, and we have anti-Semitic people, in positions of power. And they do have mass followings who trust these leaders. And this is the problem. So there's a kind of a pathological aspect to trust, which fuels xenophobia. And I'm thinking here about Taylor's earlier point that I think the blind trust, the blind faith in somebody who says to you that, well, you are sick, but you just go out there and you get a job and you'll be fine, or that swallow disinfectants and that's going to make you feel better, or that it's those people that are responsible for your for your sickness. This is the kind of pathological situation, and it's extremely hard to really know how to break through to the voter base, right, of that community, rather like people who are opposed to Hitler in the 1930s, and there were plenty of Germans who were opposed to Hitler. How were they going to reach the Hitler supporters and say that you're doing something morally wrong, that you're supporting somebody who is a criminal? How do you break through that kind of pathological trust? And I don't have the answer to that. Maybe the psychologists do. Kim, and then Rifki, you had your hand up.
I just wanted to address your point, Jami. I think the first thing is that we talk to them, and that we not close ourselves off into our little silos. That I'm still in touch daily with people I went to high school with who are Trump supporters, and they're scared to death, and so they're listening to Trump. And I'm trying to give, and sometimes it works, right? If you give them an alternative explanation, alternative way to understand their situation, many people are not as wedded to right-wing narratives as one might believe. And so I think a way to begin is and I don't mean to go to a white nationalist meeting and try to, that's insane, but there are many people, I think, who are engageable. And I think that we have a responsibility to do that, frankly.
Okay, so we are almost out of time. Rifki, you have, I know that we could maybe take 2 comments, Rifki and Nema, and then we have to close it because I know that An has to be somewhere. So real quick, Rifki and then Nema.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add in that when we as humans, as people, we're all part of systems. We're families, we have parents, we have educations, we have teachers and directors. In this community at large, we have leadership. And when there's no cohesion, it will break down and filter down to this distrust and uncertainty because we're not getting this collective message on how to pursue. Not everyone has answers, but we have to admit and own who we are, where we are, because this is bigger than us, and it has to change the whole entire global thinking politically across every spectrum here. We're going to be different. We have to understand that. And if we don't take on this humane type of realization that we're all mortals and we can help each other, that's part of that's answering to everyone, to Kimberly and certainly to Taylor and to myself, and I'm sure to scores of others. How do we move ahead? Each of us that is participating in this and wanting to evolve, wanting to change, will be the beginnings of that. So just thank you for that.
So I don't know, are we out of time here, An? Do you have to go? Are we out of time?
Yeah, I can stay for another like 5 minutes. So
Okay.
yeah, you can have like a conclusion.
I wanted to make something, say something right at the end. So Nema, if you have something really quick to say, and then we'll have to call it quits. So Nema, did you want to say something?
I didn't actually raise my hand, but
Okay.
I can say something quick. It's lovely to see you all. And I think, so I'm doing tech consulting at the moment with Accenture, and there are so many different initiatives that private companies in the city and the state are doing. And I think, as much as we do lose hope and we do wonder how to make change, people are remarkably open at this point in time, and taking advantage of that, I think, can really make a difference.
Okay, so I just wanted to, first of all, thank my co-panelists. I wanted to thank all of you for coming. And I wanted to say that I don't want this, I didn't envisage this as a sort of the beginning or the end of a conversation. I hope this happens more and amongst all of you, those of you who know each other. And at some point in the not too distant future, we should probably think about a part 2. And people have been talking about that because there's only so much you can do in an hour and 45 minutes. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say, be safe and be strong, and, in solidarity, peace on you, and stay well. Okay.